The Navy SEALs called it Mission Scrubbed. Too much fire in the sky. No one survives that storm. But then she strapped into her A-10. Thunderstrike. No backup. No way out. You'll never make it back, they warned. She didn't answer. The engines roared, and the Warthog dove head-on into the chaos. Flak lit the clouds like lightning, metal screamed. Every sane pilot would have turned away, but she carved a path straight through the hurricane, turning hell into her hunting ground. When the storm broke, the mission was done, and every man knew whose name owned it. This is Veteran Biker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week. Like, subscribe, and stay to the end. They said Alpha 7 had already written their last words. Not with ink. With breath that came ragged over a broken channel from a place maps labeled with altitude but not mercy. The message was 8 seconds of grit and truth, enough to quiet an operations tent full of officers who had run out of answers. In those 8 seconds, a canyon earned its nickname, and 12 men made peace with the idea that no one was coming. You can feel when a room gives up. It's not dramatic. It's the slight roll of a chair backward, the whisper of a pen cap, the way people stare at screens as if staring harder will turn the green glow into a path home. In the forward command at Ridgepoint, the main plot table flickered with contour lines of the Traska Range, where rock walls rose like saw teeth and crosswinds punished anything higher than treetop. The locals called the cut that swallowed Alpha 7 Hades Gate, as if the mountain itself were a threshold you crossed only once. Ammo low, high ground lost, do not attempt extraction. That was the line that pinned the room to silence. Captain Ellis Markham, liaison for Alpha 7, leaned over the table as if proximity to the map could erase the message. Someone near the comms rack exhaled and didn't realize until later they'd been holding their breath. Colonel Rowan Vance broke the quiet first, because that's what colonels do when the room forgets its spine. "We wait for night," he said, and the words didn't land like a plan so much as a confession. Low moon, rotor ingress below the ridge. Pray the mountain forgives a helicopter's noise. It would be hours, and everyone at the table knew hours were a luxury Alpha 7 did not have. No one wanted to say out loud what the topography already had. Any approach from above put metal in the sky where heat-seeking eyes were already watching. And any approach from the floor meant driving into a gauntlet the enemy had measured down to the step. Drones. The last 3 feeds showed nothing but jittering static where the canyon narrowed, like the Earth itself refused to be photographed. A junior analyst toggled layers, wind models, thermal maps, past flight paths that stopped dead at the same strangled bend. You could trace the history of failed ideas in dotted lines that never reached the creek bed where Alpha 7 had last transmitted. The analyst's knuckles had gone bloodless on the mouse. The room did what rooms do when a plan is too thin. It looked for permission to do nothing that felt like something. Colonel Vance kept his eyes on the map, but the muscle in his jaw told a different story. From the back of the tent, boots sounded on plywood, steady, unhurried, like the owner had already decided what the rest of the room hadn't. Major Raina Cole didn't clear her throat or announce herself. She didn't need to. People made space without knowing they were moving. She stopped at the edge of the table, flight suit dusted from the hanger, sleeves rolled enough to show a scorched patch sewn there, a thunderbolt split through stamped metal, the kind of unit art crew chiefs made with fabric and stubbornness. It wasn't new. It had been to places that smelled like cordite and hot oil. "We're not waiting," she said. A few heads turned with the reflex that greets audacity. Markham squinted, as if recognition might appear if he stared hard enough. Vance lifted his gaze just enough to measure the voice. "Major Cole," he said, and he didn't ask how she'd slipped past the line of people who get to speak only after they're asked. "We've lost the sky in that canyon." Raina didn't look at him yet. She traced a finger along the southern wall of the gorge, stopping just shy of a hairpin, the map labeled with a number and the ground called a grave. "You lost the sky at 400 feet, she said. "Stop thinking sky." The drone tech who'd been muttering earlier found his nerve. "You can't even see in there. Thermals ate the feed. It's a dead zone." "That's because you're trying to watch from above," she answered, voice even, not unkind. "It's not a picture that needs looking down at. It's a corridor you move through." Colonel Vance straightened, shoulders squaring under the weight of rank and consequences. "You're proposing a low pass through Hades Gate. I'm proposing we stop drawing dotted lines that quit before the problem." She tapped the map where the canyon throat constricted. "Under 200 feet on entry, south wall, you ride the shadow the mountain gives you, and the uplifts become handholds instead of punches." There was a scoff from the far side of the table, the kind that covers fear with familiarity. "That canyon chews aircraft," a comms sergeant said. "Fixed wing won't make the first bend." Raina looked up then, eyes the color of a storm front when the first chilled wind runs through hot air. She didn't sell anything with them, she simply presented facts. "Kilo Pass 3 winters ago," she said. "Different mountains, same problem. We lost the picture at the choke, and people on the ground bled because we trusted the scope more than the stone. I learned the wind by counting scrapes on my wingtips and made it back with 2 birds behind me who wouldn't have found the runway without a heartbeat to follow." She didn't wait for the room to clap. "Traska is meaner." "Good. That means the enemy trusts the terrain to do the killing. They're lazy when they think gravity is on their side." Colonel Vance's hand rested on the table edge. Outside, somewhere beyond canvas and generator noise, you could hear a tug rolling a pallet. The base going about its business because business doesn't stop for the worst day of someone else's life. "If you clip rock at that height," he said quietly, "we write 2 sets of letters." "I know what letters look like," Raina replied. "Not defensive, not melodramatic. I kept one folded in my locker for 8 years, so it would remind me not to send the real ones to someone else's home." A silence like the inside of a bell settled. The tent didn't breathe. Markham spoke because hope needs something to latch onto, and he recognized it when it walked in. "You truly know the wind in there?" "I don't know it yet," she said. "I'll learn it on the way." "Blind?" the drone tech said, almost triumphant. "Not blind," she corrected. "Just below your line of sight." Colonel Vance paced once, 3 steps and back, as if the air inside the walls had narrowed in sympathy with the canyon outside. "We have procedures," he said finally, to the room as much as to her. "We do not invent doctrine on the fly." Raina nodded. "Understood." She slid a laminated marker from the table's edge and drew a thin arc hugging the southern contour. "So don't call it doctrine. Call it an exception you'll only need once if we do it right." The line she drew wasn't a flourish. It curved with the grain of rock as if her hand had listened to stone instead of contour numbers. Everyone leaned in, even the ones who had decided they were against this before she spoke. The map accepted the line as if it had been there since the first surveyor walked the ridges. "Major," Vance said, watching the ink dry like a decision, "you lose the aircraft." "I bring back the people," she said. "We lose you." She didn't look away. "Then you'll know the cost of waiting." The colonel let out a breath that wasn't exactly surrender. It was the sound of a man who understands which risks he owns and which ones never belong to him. He touched 2 fingers to the comms operator. "Get me tower. Tell them to clear a lane." Across the room someone dropped a pen. It clattered against the table leg, and the sound was absurdly loud for something so small. The drone tech stared at his feed as if the canyon might decide to reveal itself in apology. It didn't. Raina turned without ceremony. Decisions worth anything rarely wait for applause. She stepped out into the white glare of late afternoon, canvas door flapping closed behind her. Heat lifted off the tarmac in waves, warping the horizon until mountains looked like ships pushing through fog. Hangar Bay 3 sat with its mouth open, and inside, crews moved the way good crews move, hands doing a dance that had been taught by long days and bad nights. Someone saw her, and the motion shifted, not faster, not slower, just more intentional. A young crew chief jogged up, cheeks windburned, headset crooked around his neck. He held something small in his palm. "Ma'am," he said, shifting his weight like he was suddenly unsure of the ritual for giving a gift that might matter. He turned his hand over. A fabric patch rested there, grey canvas stitched with a black bolt and the faint outline of a toothy snout. Shop art for the A-10's grin. Thunderstrike arced across the top in thread that had been pulled through and trimmed with a pocket knife. It wasn't pretty, it was perfect. "It's been on the board since Kalor," he said. "Didn't think you'd want it back until—" He didn't finish the sentence because finishing it would require admitting what people whispered about pilots who like to fly lower than fear. Raina took the patch without smiling, because there are moments where a grin would cheapen the weight. She slid it into the Velcro field on her sleeve and pressed until it sat flat. "Make sure Iron Fang is topped," she said. "She's ready," the crew chief replied, relief and adrenaline giving the words a shine. "Ammo loaded, hydraulics bled, countermeasures green. We triple-checked the flares." "Flares won't matter where I'm going," she said, and he understood that wasn't bravado, just arithmetic. Iron Fang waited with her ladder down, a beast that looked squat and unglamorous until you saw how the metal had been welded for punishment. The A-10 doesn't beg to be admired, it dares you to underestimate it. Raina climbed without first looking back at the people who had put their fingerprints on her survival. In the cockpit, the world shrank to switches and indicators that had names you could trust. She ran hands across toggles the way pianists test keys on a stage they've earned. "Talon control, Thunderstrike 1, she said into the mic once the canopy sealed and the cockpit muffled the outside into a far hum. "Request immediate wheels up on Vector 2-1. Thunderstrike 1, Tower answered, voice clipped by professionalism and something like respect's older cousin. "Cleared for immediate. Godspeed." The engines wound from whine to purpose, and the hangar throat filled with a sound that takes years to learn how to love. The Warthog rolled, turned, took the center line like it had been drawn exactly for this set of tires. Raina eased the throttles forward until the aircraft committed with her. There's a moment when the nose lifts that even skeptics hold their breath, because flight is always a vote of confidence in physics. Iron Fang left the ground and the base seemed to pause, suspended between the way we normally do things and the way we do them when normal has failed. Back in the tent, Colonel Vance stood very still, as if motion might break whatever thin strand now connected their table to the canyon. Markham stared at the blank segment of screen where the drone feed had turned to noise. The analyst's hands hovered over the keyboard, reflex looking for a way to help that didn't exist. On the far wall, the clock ticked with a patience that felt like cruelty. Raina climbed just enough to see the line of the Traskas resolve into depth, then angled toward the seam where light fell away into stone. The headset carried a last murmur from the base, line checks, weather readouts, a controller clearing some transport to a distant runway as if nothing unusual was happening at all. Habit kept the world turning. Decision would bend it. You don't think about being brave, the voiceover in your head says, if you're the sort of person who narrates your worst choices to keep from looking down. You think about the next correct thing. Raina lowered her nose and let the range grow taller. She had been told once that mountains do not care. She had answered years later by learning how to read indifference like a language. Ahead, Hades' Gate narrowed into a cut barely wider than arrogance. Wind rolled up the southern wall in invisible fists. Somewhere past the first bend, Alpha 7 waited in the kind of shade that makes men bargain with gods they haven't spoken to since childhood. The radio remained dead. The drone picture showed nothing. If you wanted to know what lived inside that stone, you had to go ask it yourself. She breathed once, the way you do before diving under a breaker. Below radar isn't a number, it's an attitude. Raina slid Iron Fang down until the altimeter told a story that made sense to no one but the machine and the pilot who trusted it. The ridgeline rose, the sky surrendered. The world reduced to a corridor carved by time and now claimed for a different kind of passage. Behind her, the base shrank into a line. Ahead, the first turn of the canyon opened its mouth. In the tent, someone whispered without meaning to, as if words could hitch a ride on radio static and make it through rock. No one corrected him. "You don't scold prayers." Raina set her jaw not in defiance but in agreement with gravity. The throttle answered. Iron Fang leaned into the dark slit in the mountains. If thunder had a direction, it pointed there. And in the space between cliff and wing, where air stacked and tumbled, where numbers betrayed and hands remembered, a single decision became a path that could carry 12 men home. The canyon accepted her, or maybe it didn't. Maybe it tried to spit her out and she flattened herself against the one line that would hold. Either way, Hades' Gate had something inside it now that it had not accounted for, a pilot who refused to ask permission from stone. The first bend took her into shadow so complete it felt like the sun had been switched off. Air churned against the fuselage, rising in sharp pockets that tried to lift one wing while dragging the other down. Raina adjusted with pressure on the stick so precise it could have been mistaken for instinct. This was the part of flight that manuals treated like myth, where readings faltered and you navigated by the feel of how the machine breathed. On the ridge above, figures moved, silhouettes against thin strips of sky. They had the advantage of height, but no line of sight on a bird hugging the cliffside. She could almost imagine their confusion, hearing only the echo of her turbines ricocheting in strange directions, never pointing to her true position. It was the kind of uncertainty she intended to turn into fear before the day was done. Behind her, Iron Fang's engines held steady, the hum threaded with a low vibration from the strain of the tight maneuvers. She scanned for thermal blooms between outcrops, quick flashes of heat that betrayed a fighter shifting his stance or the glint of a weapons tube angled toward the canyon floor. Every sighting was another knot in the rope tightening around Alpha 7. The comms crackled faintly, a hint of voice swallowed by interference. She caught fragments, ridge, contact, pinned. It was enough to confirm they were still in the fight, but not enough to plot exact coordinates. She banked slightly, bringing the southern wall closer, letting the updraft curl under her wing for lift without climbing into the enemy's view. Every foot of elevation here was a gamble she wasn't willing to take. Through the HUD's flicker, the topography ahead rolled toward a second choke point. Raina traced the valley's curve in her mind, recalling how wind tended to rush through narrowings like water through a nozzle. Faster, meaner. She would need to ride that push instead of resisting it, using the acceleration to slingshot toward the position she guessed Alpha 7 had been holding. Guessing was dangerous, but stalling here was worse. A low ridge loomed ahead, layered in shadow, its crest crawling with movement. She caught the faint flare of a lens, glass catching sunlight for a split second. Sniper! The angle told her he was watching the route out, not expecting a fixed wing from this approach. She rolled slightly, presenting as little profile as possible while skimming beneath the rock clip. Her fingers hovered over the weapons control, but she held fire. Not yet. Precision here was about timing as much as aim. One premature burst would echo through the gorge and erase her element of surprise. The second choke narrowed enough to make the altimeter spit a warning. She killed the alarm with a flick. A pilot's focus couldn't afford the distraction of a machine trying to scare her with numbers. The belly of Iron Fang passed so close to the slope that dust curled into the wake, swirling briefly before falling away. She could see grass stalks bending from the pressure wave. Her mind replayed the drone feeds from earlier, frames that had gone to static before the canyon's true teeth showed. Somewhere just beyond this point was where other pilots had turned back or been forced down. Raina's breath was measured, a slow exchange meant to keep her hands steady. She shifted her gaze between the HUD and the real world beyond the canopy, noting subtle differences, how the light changed at each bend, how the shadow lines betrayed protruding stone before the sensors caught them. A voice finally broke clean through the static. "Thunderstrike, this is Markham. Do you read?" The signal was shaky, but enough to bring clarity. "We've got partial on Alpha 7. Heat SIGs clustered south of Dry Creek Bed. They're holding low ground. Hostiles on both ridges reinforced positions. That confirmed her earlier suspicion. She thumbed the mic. "Copy. Sending steel your way. Keep them tight." She eased the throttle forward, letting the A-10 surge. The gorge blurred past, walls a mix of basalt and scree, the colors shifting as she moved deeper. She imagined the defenders hearing that distant growl and wondering if it was real or just the wind. Another flicker on thermal. Three signatures hauling something long and narrow into place. Too much heat at the tip to be a simple rifle. RPG team. They were in the notch of a spur jutting from the northern wall, angled for a clear shot at any ground unit breaking cover. She fed in rudder, pivoting the nose to line up the gun without committing to a full pass just yet. The GAU-8 status lights glowed ready in the corner of her vision. She kept the safety on, breathing through the count in her head until the spur's rock shoulder cleared enough to give her a clean line. When it did, she squeezed. The Avenger's voice was a guttural roar, each round leaving the muzzle in a streak too fast to see until it found stone, armor, or flesh. The RPG crew disintegrated into fragments and dust, their weapon clattering uselessly against the wall. The echoes rolled away like distant thunder. The moment she lifted off the trigger, she banked hard to the right, hugging the curve so tightly the wingtip felt as though it was brushing the rock. Below, the canyon floor widened briefly, revealing the pale scar of the creek bed. Movement darted between boulders, Alpha 7, by the pattern of their scatter, making short dashes from cover to cover. "Alpha 7, Thunderstrike," she called, hoping the radio's ghosts would carry her words. "I'm here. Stay low. Move south." No reply, but she hadn't expected one. They'd be busy staying alive. A sudden flash from the east ridge pulled her eyes. Another launch tube, this one already spitting smoke. Man pads, too far for her current vector to intercept directly, but close enough to make her decide on the next move without second guessing. She chopped throttle, dropped altitude even further, letting the missile seeker overshoot where it expected her to be. The plume arced wide, detonating against a rock face with a bloom of orange and black. The evasion had cost her speed, and in a space this tight, regaining momentum without climbing was tricky. She shoved the throttles forward again, feeling the acceleration pin her back just enough to remind her of the physics at play. The gorge seemed to narrow in protest, as if trying to smother her escape with stone. Ahead lay the last bend before the open stretch that led to Alpha 7's position. Her pulse slowed deliberately, matching the rhythm she'd trained into herself for moments when adrenaline wanted to take the controls. The bend hid whatever came next, reinforcements, ambush, or empty sky. It was the nature of places like this to reveal the truth only when you were committed past the point of turning. As she approached, the radio hissed again, fragments of shouting layered over gunfire. "Under fire, North Ridge, can't." The rest was lost, but it didn't matter. She had enough to know that hesitation here meant the fight would end without her. Raina rolled into the bend, letting centrifugal force press her into the harness. The world outside tilted into a wall of stone on one side and a sudden glimpse of the valley floor on the other. In that fleeting view she counted muzzle flashes. Too many, too close to the line Alpha 7 needed to cross. They'd be cut down before reaching extraction unless she tore a hole in that wall of fire. The decision was immediate. She leveled just enough to bring the targeting reticle over the densest cluster, thumbed the safety off again, and loosed a controlled burst. Stone erupted, splinters of rock and dirt blotting out the shooters. She adjusted slightly, walking the fire along the ridge to collapse any position that still spat back. Each strike carved another second of survival for the team below. Pulling out of the run, she could see Alpha 7 surging forward, taking advantage of the chaos she'd sown. It wasn't safety, not yet, but it was movement. And movement was life in a place built to hold you still. The gorge behind her was now a haze of dust and echoes. Ahead lay the harder part, holding the lane open long enough for 12 battered operators to run the length of a kill zone without joining the canyon's long memory of failures. She pushed Iron Fang onward, deeper into the maze, every sense tuned for the next threat, every muscle braced for the fight still to come. The dust from her last strafing run still hung in the air, a drifting veil that caught the late-day light and turned the canyon into a shifting gold-and-grey haze. Raina didn't slow to admire it. She kept Iron Fang low and tight to the rock, the southern wall close enough that the paint on her wingtip might scrape if she drifted a hair too far. Every second she stayed this deep meant more chances for the enemy to guess her rhythm, more opportunities for them to adapt. She had to stay unpredictable. On her left, a thin seam of shadow ran down the cliff face, a vertical fault line she used as a visual guide. Following it meant she could mask her profile from spotters on the upper ridges. She alternated glances between that seam and the valley ahead, knowing one lapse in attention could turn the next bend into her last. The narrow gap magnified every sound, the growl of the turbines, the faint metallic rattle from somewhere in the fuselage, even the occasional tick of grit striking the canopy. Alpha 7's heat signatures flickered on her thermal display, still clustered near the creek bed. They'd gained some ground since her opening salvo, but their path to the extraction point was far from clear. The ridges ahead were alive with hostile movement, shapes darting between rocks, pausing only to fire down into the valley. Raina needed to break their focus before the team tried to sprint the final stretch. Her eyes caught something different on the display, a trio of hot spots moving fast along a goat trail that curved down toward the creek. It wasn't infantry. The heat pattern was too large and too irregular. Technicals, pickup trucks with mounted weapons, their route would give them a perfect flanking angle on Alpha 7's position. If they reached that point, they could box the team in from below. She dipped the nose of the A-10, aligning herself with the narrow trail. The vehicles were bouncing hard on the uneven path, the gunners bracing themselves against roll bars as they scanned for targets. They didn't see her yet, too focused on the soldiers they intended to trap. Raina throttled up, closing the distance in seconds. The moment they came into the GAU-8's arc, she opened fire. The lead truck folded inward under the impact, its front axle tearing free. The second vehicle veered in panic, catching a rock and flipping sideways. The last managed to brake, its occupants spilling out and scrambling for cover, only to be cut down by a short follow-up burst. She banked sharply to avoid the rising smoke pulling back toward the canyon's main channel. Each time she climbed even slightly, the sky opened up just enough to remind her how much safer it would be up there and how quickly the enemy could cut her down if she took it. She kept low, hugging the contours, using every shadow as a shield. The radio hissed to life, clearer this time. Thunderstrike, Alpha 7, moving south 300 meters from the mark. taking fire from East Ridge. Heavy. The voice was clipped, breathless. No time for more. Raina's gaze swept the ridgeline to the east. The fighters there were entrenched behind a stepped formation of stone, firing down in controlled bursts. The angle was brutal. She couldn't just fly level and rake the line without exposing herself to return fire from the opposite wall. She'd have to use the terrain's folds. She traced a mental path. Drop into the lower basin, swing wide under the cover of an overhang, then pop up at an oblique angle to sweep the ridge from below. It would be a fast, slashing run, one pass to do as much damage as possible before retreating back into cover. She executed the plan without hesitation, feeling the surge of acceleration as she committed to the dive. The overhang swallowed her in shadow, momentarily hiding her from anyone above. Then she rolled into the climb, bursting into the sunlight just below the enemy's firing positions. The gun spat thunder. Rock and dust exploded around the fighters, tearing away their makeshift barricades. Some tried to retreat along the ridge spine, others simply vanished in the concussive haze. By the time she leveled out, the East Ridge was silent, save for the settling debris. Her relief was short-lived. A bright flare in the periphery, West Ridge near the extraction point, signaled incoming trouble. Through the dust, she spotted a cluster of enemy troops setting up what looked like a crew-served weapon, possibly a heavy machine gun or an autocannon. Positioned there, they could rake the entire LZ and cut down the Chinooks before they landed. She nosed down toward them, but a ripple of movement on the far side of the canyon forced a split-second decision. Another RPG team had emerged further back along Alpha 7's escape route. If she chased the gun crew, the RPG team might get a clear shot at her or the soldiers on the ground. If she targeted the RPGs first, the crew at the LZ would have more time to finish their setup. Her instincts chose for her. She swung toward the RPGs, hitting them with a precise burst that shredded the launcher and sent its operators diving for cover. Without slowing, she rolled into a hard turn toward the LZ, her vision tunneling on the growing silhouette of the gun emplacement. They'd already braced the weapon on its tripod, the loader feeding a belt of ammunition into the receiver. She fired before they could test their aim. The rounds tore through the position, the weapon flipping backward in a shower of sparks. A few survivors tried to scatter downslope, but she tracked them with short, measured bursts until they were no longer a threat. "Thunderstrike, LZ clear for now," she reported, her voice calm despite the thrum of adrenaline. "Bring in the birds." A crackle in her headset, copy, inbound 2 mics. The Chinooks were on their way. That meant she needed to hold the perimeter, keep anything with a weapon from looking in the direction of the landing zone. Raina swung back north, scanning for fresh movement. The canyon seemed to tighten its grip the deeper she went, every bend concealing the possibility of a counterattack. She kept the Warthog's speed in the sweet spot, fast enough to cover ground quickly, slow enough to react if a new threat emerged. She felt the aircraft's subtle vibrations through the stick, every hum and rattle a reminder of the strain she was putting on the machine. Alpha 7 came into view again, their figures darting between jagged outcrops as they closed the last gap to the LZ. From above, they looked small against the immensity of the landscape, tiny flashes of color in a world of stone and shadow. She allowed herself no sentiment. The best thing she could give them was another minute alive. The eastern ridge, the one she'd cleared earlier, was showing signs of life again. A handful of enemy fighters had crept back to the edge, perhaps thinking she'd moved on. She angled toward them, letting the sight of the A-10 bear down before she opened fire. The psychological shock was almost as important as the physical damage. Each strike had to remind them that the air above this canyon belonged to her, however briefly. As she pulled up from the run, her gaze swept the horizon beyond the canyon's mouth. Dust plumes marked the approach of more vehicles, likely reinforcements rushing in from the outer trails. They were too far to engage yet, but their direction was clear. They intended to block any retreat once Alpha 7 was airborne. That knowledge hardened her focus. The mission wasn't just about clearing a path to the helicopters, it was about making sure those helicopters could lift off and escape without being chased out of the sky. She keyed the mic again. "Markham, heads up. You've got inbound from the north, convoy size unknown. ETA 5 mics to outer perimeter." His reply was terse. "Understood. We'll be off the deck before they arrive." She didn't share his optimism out loud. Instead, she turned Iron Fang toward the canyon's northern approach, already plotting how she'd intercept whatever came through. The sun had dipped just enough to throw long shadows across the ridges, making it harder to read movement at a glance. She adjusted her angle, using the light's direction to her advantage, keeping herself hidden from anyone watching the approach. Every choice now was about buying time. Seconds stacked on seconds until Alpha 7's boots were off the stone. And Raina Cole had no intention of giving a single one back. The distant columns of dust were growing taller now, splitting into multiple streams that snaked along the outer trails toward the canyon's mouth. Raina recognized the pattern from years of close air support runs, a staggered approach meant to overwhelm defenses by arriving from different angles at once. They weren't here to probe, they were coming to seal the trap before the Chinooks could rise out of reach. She shifted her grip on the stick, nudging Iron Fang into a shallow climb that let her see over the next ridge without exposing herself too long. The sight confirmed her concern. Half a dozen vehicles, some with mounted weapons, others crammed with fighters holding launch tubes out the windows. They'd timed their push to coincide with the extraction. If they broke through, Alpha 7 would be boxed in, helicopters or not. She rolled back into the canyon, skimming the contours until she found a gap wide enough to turn. The plan forming in her head was risky. Hit the convoy before it reached the choke, force them to scatter in the open where they'd have no cover from her gun. It meant leaving the immediate perimeter for a minute or two, trusting that the soldiers on the ground could hold their positions until she returned. There was no better option. Banking hard, she aimed for the narrowest approach route, the one the lead vehicle was already threading. The A-10's shadows swept across the rocky slope, drawing the first panicked reaction from the column. Gunners twisted in their mounts, searching for the threat, but she was already on them. The Avenger cannon spoke in a voice that made the stone vibrate, ripping through the front of the lead truck. Metal and dust erupted together, the debris forcing the following vehicles to brake or swerve. Without pausing, she walked her fire down the trail, hitting engines and gun mounts in short bursts. One technical tried to reverse out, only to catch a burst square through the cab. Another spun into a ditch, the sudden stop pitching its crew into the dirt. The survivors scrambled for the cover of boulders, but the open terrain offered them little protection from the A-10's precision. She pulled up before the slope forced her hand, letting the momentum carry her into a climbing arc that revealed the next wave. Smaller, faster vehicles attempting to flank through a parallel path. She leveled out and came in from their side, catching them before they could merge with the main route. 2 quick bursts neutralized the threat, the second impact sending a plume of smoke curling upward like a warning flag. By the time she swung back toward the canyon, the northern approach was littered with burning wrecks and scattered fighters too disorganized to mount a coherent push. It would slow them, but she knew it wouldn't stop them entirely. Reinforcements always found a way to regroup. Her headset crackled with Markham's voice, this time sharper. "Thunderstrike, we've got movement on the high ridge east of the LZ. Multiple launchers coming into position." She didn't waste time acknowledging. The high ridge was a perfect angle to hit the helicopters during liftoff. She dove back into the canyon's shadow, engines howling as she pushed the Warthog toward the coordinates in her head. The terrain tightened again, forcing her to weave through rock spines before she could line up a shot. The fighters on the ridge were quick. They'd already set up several tubes, their spotters scanning the sky, but they hadn't accounted for her approach from below the horizon. She rose into view with no warning, the GAU-8 roaring to life. The first pass shredded 2 launcher teams, scattering the rest into frantic retreat. She looped for a second strike, targeting the weapons left abandoned. Each was chewed apart until it posed no danger. From her altitude, she caught a glimpse of the extraction zone. The Chinooks were just setting down, rotors kicking up violent spirals of dust that blurred the scene. Alpha 7 emerged through that haze, their movement purposeful despite the chaos. They were close, too close for comfort, to the moment where they'd be most vulnerable. Raina angled to put herself between the LZ and any possible firing line. A glint on the far slope caught her eye, an RPG team hugging the cliff, hoping the dust would mask their presence. She side-slipped to bring them into her sights and sent a controlled burst their way. The rocket dropped harmlessly, its operator flung back by the impact. The next minute felt like an eternity. She circled the LZ, eyes sweeping every ridge, every outcrop, listening to the engines for any hint of strain. The dust storm from the rotor wash made visibility patchy, but it also worked in her favor, masking her position from would-be attackers further out. Load complete. 30 seconds to lift off came the call over the net. She tightened her pattern, keeping her turns crisp to avoid telegraphing her path. It was in these final moments that ambushers often revealed themselves. Sure enough, movement flickered at the canyon's southern mouth, 2 fighters dragging a heavy case into position. It wasn't the speed of their setup, but the deliberate care that chilled her. This wasn't a hasty shot, it was a planned strike. She pushed the throttles, closing the gap before they could finish. The burst from her cannon tore through their position, the case tumbling open to reveal another launcher that would never fire. The Chinooks began to lift, the deep thump of their blades merging with the low roar of her own engines. Raina stayed low, pacing their climb, daring any remaining threats to show themselves. None did, whether it was the pounding dust, the wrecked vehicles, or the memory of her earlier passes. The enemy chose to melt back into the stone. As the helicopters cleared the immediate kill zone, she widened her circuit, scanning the approaches one last time. The northern trail still smoldered from her earlier strikes. The ridges bore fresh scars where weapons had been destroyed. It wasn't safety, not yet, but it was enough. She keyed the mic. Alpha 7 secure. LZ clear. I'm escorting them out. The reply carried a note she hadn't heard before. Relief, unfiltered. Copy that, Thunderstrike. Lead the way. She nosed Iron Fang toward the canyon's open edge, her eyes still moving, still searching. The mission wasn't over until the last of them was beyond the reach of these walls. The Chinooks clawed their way upward, rotors straining in the thin canyon air. Raina kept Iron Fang just ahead of their flight path, sliding across the mouth of the gorge like a steel curtain. The sun's angle cast the lower ridges into deep contrast, making every rock shadow look like it might hide a gunner. She couldn't assume the fight was finished, not with so much ground between them and the open plateau. Her gaze cut toward the western slope. A trail there, barely visible from above, curved in toward their projected route. Dust rising from its far end told her someone was moving fast. She rolled the A-10 into a descending turn, angling to intercept before whatever was coming could crest into range. The HUD began to flicker from the tight maneuver, but she ignored it, trusting the feel of the stick and the rumble under her boots. As she closed, shapes took form. 3 motorbikes weaving through the rocks, each rider with a slung launcher. They were light, fast, and could vanish into cover before the helicopters even spotted them. Raina didn't give them the chance. She let the nose drop and tapped the trigger in short, lethal bursts. The first bike cartwheeled into the slope, the second slid sideways into a boulder, its rider tumbling out of sight. The third tried to dart under an overhang, but she curved her fire just enough to catch it before it disappeared. The debris still hung in the air when a new call crackled in her ear. Convoy regrouping north side, possible push to intercept at egress point. The enemy wasn't done. Even battered, they were trying to box the team in one last time. Raina pulled back into formation with the Chinooks, scanning ahead. The terrain beyond the canyon narrowed again before opening to the rolling flats. If the convoy made it to that pinch point first, the helicopters would be forced to climb higher than planned, exposing themselves to any remaining heavy weapons. She throttled forward, braking ahead of the escort pattern. The air flattened against the canopy as she pushed the Warthog into a sprint. Soon the pinch came into view, a shallow saddle between two ridges, littered with outcrops that could conceal men or mounted guns. Through the haze, she caught the glint of metal, vehicles easing into position. Too far for ground fire yet, but not for long. She approached from the south side of the saddle where the slope was fractured and uneven. Dropping low, she used the terrain as a mask until she was almost level with the enemy's flank. By the time they saw her, she was already firing. The first two trucks erupted in a chain of detonations, their payloads cooking off in a wash of flame. Fighters scattered in all directions, some diving for cover, others running straight into her second burst. The saddle cleared in under 30 seconds, but she didn't linger. Banking hard, she swept the opposite ridge, looking for any team that might still be in position. A small crew scrambled along the rocks with what looked like another launcher case. She made a quick pass, shredding the weapon before they could assemble it. With the bottleneck neutralized, she swung back toward the extraction flight. The Chinooks were closing fast, their heavy silhouettes framed against the widening sky beyond the canyon's edge. She eased back into an escort position, slightly higher now to get a broader view of the approaches. The radio came alive again, this time with Markham's voice steady but edged. "Thunderstrike, you're clear to peel off once we're past Ridge 4. We'll take it from there." She didn't answer immediately, eyes still sweeping the terrain. On the far horizon, the dust plumes had thinned, the earlier chaos leaving the enemy scattered and disorganized. But she knew better than to relax too soon. Only when the last ridgeline slid beneath them, the valley falling away into open land, did she allow herself a measured breath. "Copy, Alpha 7. You've got clean air ahead." She banked away, letting the Chinooks surge forward on their own course, her own path arcing wide to watch their flank until they were small against the glare. Then she turned Iron Fang toward base, the battlefield unspooling beneath her in reverse, smoke columns, scarred stone, and the narrow thread of canyon that had tried to keep 12 soldiers from ever leaving it alive. The mission wasn't over until she landed, but the hardest part was behind her, and for now, the sky was hers alone. The return leg began deceptively calm. From altitude, the ranges rolled away in uneven folds, light washing over the ridges as if the fighting had never touched them. But Raina had flown enough combat egresses to know the silence after contact was often when the most desperate attempts came. Retreating forces were like cornered animals. They'd strike even if they couldn't win, simply to leave a mark. She kept Iron Fang high enough to see the terrain's patterns, low enough to drop back into the folds if needed. The base was still many minutes away, and the path home took her over several approaches the enemy could use to harass the outbound helicopters. She no longer had them in direct sight. Markham's birds were beyond visual range now, but her role as rear guard meant covering anything chasing their tail. A thin contrail in the far distance snagged her attention. It wasn't high enough to be friendly air traffic, and the line was too short-lived for fixed wing. A helicopter, possibly, but wrong profile for coalition models. She nosed down for a closer look. Through the haze, a twin-rotor silhouette resolved. an older gunship model still favored by irregular forces in these hills, slow, armored, and carrying enough rockets to make the Chinook's climb risky if it got within range. She flipped the master arm back on and swung wide, angling for an intercept that would keep the gunship from spotting her until she was already diving. Closing from above, she let the Warthog's bulk cast its shadow only in the final seconds. The cannon tore into the fuselage with surgical precision, and the rotors sheared apart in a violent shudder. The machine corkscrewed down, hitting a slope in a burst of dust and twisted metal. No time to savor the kill. Her radar warning light flared crimson, a missile lock. The system's tone was sharp and insistent, a predator's growl in electronic form. She yanked the A-10 into a brake turn, deploying countermeasures in a controlled pattern. The first set of flares burned out harmlessly, but a plume of smoke cutting across her peripheral told her the missile had already been loosed. She dropped even lower, using a sheer escarpment as a barrier. The warhead tracked into the cliff instead, detonating in a blossom of rock and smoke. She leveled out in a narrow defile, breath measured, checking her instruments. The strain on the airframe from that maneuver showed in a slight vibration through the stick. Not dangerous yet, but a reminder the aircraft had taken punishment all day. Pressing on, she skirted along the leeward side of a long ridge, heading toward a stretch of open ground she'd need to cross before entering friendlier airspace. It was here she spotted the last complication. A column of dismounted fighters hauling gear up toward a saddle that overlooked the exit corridor. Their route was steep and rough, but once at the crest, they could use even light weapons to harass the withdrawal route. She rolled to align with the slope, keeping her nose just below the skyline so her silhouette wouldn't give away her approach. Once in position, she lifted over the crest and released a short burst, scattering the group before they could set up. Packs and weapons tumbled downslope, the survivors diving into gullies. She raked the ground once more for good measure, then pulled away toward the flats. Only when the foothills began to give way to the wider basin did she ease the throttles back. The distant glint of hangar roofs marked the base, and the tower's voice came through clear for the first time since she'd left. Thunderstrike 1 cleared straight in, runway 28. She acknowledged, adjusting her descent. The familiar geometry of the airfield filled her windscreen, but the approach felt heavier than any in recent memory. The battle's adrenaline was ebbing, leaving only the solid weight of what it had cost the machine and herself to bring Alpha 7 out. Touchdown came hard, the tires screaming under the load. She held the nose off as long as the speed allowed, then eased it down, breaking in measured pulses to keep the aircraft controllable. Iron Fang rolled to a stop with the engines ticking down into silence, steam curling from vents along the fuselage. Ground crews were already moving, chocks in hand, eyes taking in the blackened wing edges, pitted skin, and streaks where heat and dust had ground into the paint. Raina popped the canopy and removed her helmet, the rush of outside air carrying the faint tang of fuel and scorched metal. She climbed down, boots hitting the tarmac with the firmness of someone who had no illusions about how close the day had been. The medics hovered, as they always did after a sortie this rough, but she waved them off with a small motion. Her legs ached from hours braced against G-forces, her shoulders tight from constant corrections, but she was upright. That was enough for now. Around her, the maintenance crew closed in on Iron Fang, their hands already tracing the damage that would need hours, maybe days, to repair. She walked clear of the immediate work area, removing the Thunderstrike patch from her sleeve and looking at it for a long moment, not in sentiment, but in acknowledgement. It had earned its place again today. Then she fixed it back where it belonged and glanced toward the operations building, where debrief would inevitably dig into every decision, every deviation from procedure. She'd answer their questions, same as always, and the official record would be what it would be. But out in the hills, 12 men were alive who wouldn't have been otherwise, and as far as Raina Cole was concerned, that was the only ledger that mattered. The debrief room smelled faintly of coffee gone cold, paper, and the metallic tang that seemed to cling to every operations tent and forward base conference space. The walls were lined with maps layered in acetate sheets, each one dotted with grease pencil notes from missions that had wrapped hours or years ago. A projector hummed softly, throwing a frozen satellite image of the Traska range onto the far wall. Raina sat near the end of the table, flight suit half unzipped, a folder of hastily printed sortie data in front of her. The chairs were filled with a mix of operations officers, intelligence analysts, and a few faces from command who had flown in just for this meeting. Colonel Rowan Vance was at the head, his cap resting beside the microphone he hadn't touched yet. They began with the official questions, working through the sequence of events in clinical order. Your ingress path, was it planned in advance or improvised based on conditions? Both, Raina replied, her voice even. I studied the southern wall before takeoff, but the final approach had to adapt to wind shear and visual cues. She didn't bother adding that there was no way to pre-plan a perfect run through terrain that changed its mood by the hour. An intelligence officer leaned forward. Your engagement with the northern convoy, what was your fuel state at that point? She recalled the gauges clearly, a habit drilled into her over hundreds of sorties. Below optimal for extended loiter, but within parameters for continued combat. They noted her answer, the pen scratching on a yellow legal pad. Then came the pointed questions. Protocol deviations, risks taken without prior clearance, ordnance expenditure that didn't align with standard mission profiles. She didn't flinch. Every move had been necessary in the moment. One of the visiting staff, a man with a pentagon pin on his lapel, spoke without looking directly at her. Major, what you executed out there does not conform to existing low-altitude doctrine. At times, you were operating below the recommended safety envelope. Raina's reply was simple. The safety envelope wouldn't have gotten them out. That drew a faint tightening around his mouth, but no further comment. Vance, sitting like a silent counterweight at the head of the table, finally spoke. The record will reflect both the risks and the results. His tone was deliberately neutral, but Raina caught the faintest shift in his eyes, a flicker of pride he didn't voice in front of the room. When the session ended, the chatter in the room rose, officers exchanging quiet assessments as they filed out. Raina remained seated until most had gone, then gathered her folder and stepped into the hallway. The air outside the debrief space felt cooler, freer. Markham was waiting near the door, still in his dusty uniform from the extraction flight. Heard you took some heat in there, he said, falling into step beside her. She gave a half smile, nothing worse than what was coming from the ridges. They walked toward the flight line, where Iron Fang was now roped off, a small crowd of maintainers already deep into damage assessment. One of the crew chiefs looked up as she approached, holding a piece of warped metal that had once been part of the stabilizer. You'll want to see this, he called. The fragment was scorched, edges curled inward from heat. Impact from the manpads? She asked. He nodded. Didn't fully detonate on contact, skipped along the skin before breaking apart. Lucky it didn't rip the controls out. She ran a thumb along the twisted edge. Luck, or perhaps just another fraction of a second that had tipped in her favor. Either way, the sight of it drove home how narrow the margin had been. As the crew returned to their work, she stepped back to take in the whole aircraft. The A-10 looked battered but not beaten, its paint dulled under a thin coat of canyon dust. Each scar was a sentence in the day's story, and she could read them like lines in a familiar book. By evening, the base had settled into its slower rhythm. Raina found herself in the mess hall, seated across from Vance at a corner table. The colonel stirred his coffee without drinking it. Pentagon will want to review your after-action in detail, he said. You might be grounded until they've chewed it over. That's their prerogative, she replied. My job was to bring them home. He set the spoon down, leaning forward slightly. You did more than that. You set a precedent, whether they like it or not. The words hung between them, unadorned. She didn't need a commendation. The fact that Alpha 7 was sleeping in their bunks instead of lying silent in the canyon was enough. Later, in her quarters, she powered on the small desk monitor. Already someone had uploaded helmet cam footage from the extraction. Grainy video showed the warthog knifing between cliffs, cannon blazing, the image shaking with every burst. The comments were a mix of awe and disbelief, viewers trying to reconcile what they were seeing with the rules they'd been taught about air combat. She clicked it off. Let them talk. The people who needed to understand already did. Before sleeping, she laid the Thunderstrike patch on the nightstand. It wasn't superstition. It was a reminder that call signs weren't just handed out. They were earned, and sometimes re-earned. Today had been one of those days. The next morning brought a formal summons. Not from base command, but from a liaison to an advanced training program that had been quietly assembling for months. The idea was to develop a cadre of pilots capable of extreme low-level operations in environments considered no-fly by current doctrine. We want you as an instructor, the liaison said, sliding a sealed folder across the table. Real terrain, real stress, no simulators unless you request them. You'd have your pick of the candidates. Raina studied the folder without opening it. And if I say no? He gave a small shrug. Then we'll keep flying the way we always have. But you've proven there's another way. It wasn't a decision she needed to sleep on. When do I start? A slow smile crossed his face. 3 weeks. That should give your bird enough time in the hangar to be jealous. When she stepped outside, the flight line was bathed in the pale light of early day. Iron Fang sat in the open, panels removed, tools glinting as the crew worked. She walked past, laying a hand briefly on the side of the fuselage. We're not done yet, she murmured. Somewhere beyond the perimeter fence, the Trasker range was quiet again. But it wouldn't stay that way forever. And when the call came, she intended to be ready. Whether it was to lead the next sortie herself or to send another pilot into the storm she had learned to call home. 3 weeks later, the air over the training range shimmered with heat, and the smell of jet fuel carried on the wind like an unspoken promise. Raina Cole stood at the edge of the tarmac, helmet tucked under one arm, watching the incoming line of aircraft glide toward the apron. These weren't frontline combat birds, yet. They were clean, freshly serviced A-10Cs pulled from different squadrons, each assigned to a pilot handpicked for this new program. The candidates stepped down from their cockpits with the energy of people who thought they knew what they were in for. Some were seasoned in conventional KS work, others were younger, fresh from weapons school with hours of simulator time under their belts. None of them had flown into a place like Hades Gate, and that was the point. "Major Cole?" one of them asked as they approached, tall and broad-shouldered, his visor still pushed high on his helmet. "You're the one running this circus?" She let the faintest smirk show. "If it feels like a circus, you're doing it wrong. Out here, you learn to make the terrain work for you, or it will decide how you leave." The briefing room was bare except for a wall-sized relief map of the range. Raina didn't bother with a slide deck. She pointed to a jagged section of ridges and valleys. "This is where you'll be earning your hours. It's smaller than what I worked in overseas, but the principles are the same. Variable wind, false lines of sight, choke points you can't see until you're in them. If you stay inside the numbers on your instruments, you'll fail. If you ignore them completely, you'll meet the ridge up close. Your job is to fly in the space between those two mistakes." Hands went up. "What altitude limits? Weapons load? How do we avoid wake turbulence in formation at that height?" She answered each with the precision of someone who'd learned the hard way, emphasizing adaptability over rote procedure. No one's grading you on a checklist here. We're measuring survival and effect on target. You can't have one without the other. The first flights were deliberately uneventful. Short runs through the easier gullies, forcing the pilots to read wind shifts by watching how the scrub trees bent, how dust plumes twisted off the slopes. Raina led the formation at a measured pace, her voice calm over the net, pointing out landmarks and hazards as they appeared. Some of the rookies flew too rigidly, overcorrecting at every gust. Others got bold too soon, cutting corners that left their wingmen scrambling to adjust. Back on the ground, she didn't sugarcoat it. Your stick inputs should be a conversation with the air, not an argument. You argue, the canyon wins, and it doesn't care who you are. Over the next week, the runs grew more complex. Sharper bends, steeper drops, simulated threats placed in positions designed to punish lazy scanning. The training crews had mounted heat-emitting decoys on the ridges, forcing the pilots to identify, evade, or engage while maintaining low profiles. Raina demonstrated one approach after another, sometimes peeling off at the last second to avoid a missile, sometimes popping up briefly to take a shot before dropping back into concealment. By the second week, the candidates began to mirror her fluidity. Their comms chatter tighter, their flight paths cleaner. She knew they were ready for the final evolution when she saw them adjusting to each other's micro-movements without waiting for radio calls. That particular evaluation unfolded under a sky wrapped in a pale, shifting haze, the kind that dulled the horizon and made judging distance just a little more difficult. The exercise itself had been deliberately designed to stretch every pilot in the class to their limits. Scattered across the training range were several friendly ground teams, represented by marked positions and role players, each one under simulated assault from different sectors at the same time. The mission wasn't just about hitting targets, it demanded layered thinking. They would have to divide their flight into elements, plan and execute multiple strikes almost simultaneously, keep a constant eye on fuel status, and then pull out of the area in a coordinated withdrawal that left no exploitable opening for the notional enemy to chase them through. Raina took off with them that morning, not to set the pace, but to serve as a high-cover sentinel. She kept her call sign out of the chatter, speaking only if she spotted a lapse that could jeopardize the run. Her presence was there to guide, not to dominate. The invisible weight on the safety net. The opening phase unfolded smoothly. In carefully timed pairs, the warthogs cut through the first set of canyons, hugging the terrain so closely that from the ground they would have looked like streaks of shadow against the rock. Each team rolled into their attack passes with practiced precision, hammering the mock hostile positions before disappearing again into concealment, their profiles fleeting blurs on the range cameras. Then the weather turned. Midway through the sequence, an unplanned shift in the wind swept crosswise through one of the primary ingress routes. The gusts rolled down the slope at just the wrong moment, pushing a less experienced element higher than intended. That extra altitude put them directly into the line of sight for a simulated infrared tracking system hidden along the ridge. In a real fight, it would have been a missile lock. Raina's voice cut through the net, crisp and unhesitating. "Break left, get down now!" Hug the wall. The pair reacted instantly, banking hard and dropping altitude until they were skimming the shadowed side of the gully. Using the rock face as cover, they slipped out of the tracker's envelope and re-emerged on the far side without another hit recorded. By the time all flights converged on the designated extraction zone, the tempo in every cockpit had shifted. Even over the radio, their breathing carried that subtle edge, heavier, faster, born of close calls and tight maneuvers. In the control tent, the scoreboards lit green across the board. Objectives achieved, simulated casualties few. It was, on paper, a pass. But every pilot in that lineup understood just how narrow the margin had been and how quickly the result could have tipped the other way. After the final sortie, the class gathered in the hangar. The smell of jet exhaust lingered in their clothes, a reminder that they'd been down where mistakes are measured in seconds. Raina looked at each of them in turn. "You've seen the margins," she said. "You know how thin they are. Carry that into every flight, not just here, not just when the odds are bad, every time." One of the younger pilots, callsign Finch, asked the question that had been hanging in the air since they'd met. "Ma'am, what made you take that canyon run in the first place? Everything we've been taught says you shouldn't." She didn't answer right away, letting the hum of cooling engines fill the space, because someone had to. And when you're that someone, you don't measure the drop, you measure what's waiting if you don't take it. The room was quiet after that, the kind of silence that means the point has landed deeper than any checklist could. In the months that followed, word about the program spread quietly through the community. Pilots rotated in and out, each leaving sharper than they arrived. Some would later send messages from deployments, short notes describing missions where the training had made the difference between extraction and loss. For Raina, the work didn't feel like a victory lap. It was simply the next necessary thing. Between classes, she still flew solo profiles through the range, refining her own techniques, testing the limits of both machine and mind. Iron Fang returned to full health, every panel restored, but the faint discolorations in the metal near the wing roots remained. A reminder of the day they'd both gone further than expected. Now and then, she'd catch news feeds showing the faces of Alpha 7 at other operations, alive and in the fight. They never sent public thanks, and she never asked for it. The fact that they were still out there was enough. On a late afternoon when the light turned the ridges bronze, she taxied Iron Fang to the line after another training run. Shutting down the engines, she looked across the airfield toward the horizon. The Trasker range lay far beyond sight, but in her mind she could still trace every bend of Hades Gate, every shift of wind along its walls. She removed the Thunderstrike patch and turned it once in her palm before pressing it back onto her sleeve, not as ceremony, just as confirmation. The call sign wasn't about one mission or one pilot. It was about the choice to go where no one else would, and to bring others through with you. Somewhere, sometime soon, another call would come, and when it did, she'd be ready to answer. Not because it was safe, not because it was certain, but because there are moments when the only way forward is to fly straight into the storm and make the sky yours again. When the dust finally settled over the range and the last echoes of engine noise faded into the quiet, the lesson remained. What had begun as another training cycle had turned into something far more telling, a reminder that skill alone isn't enough. It takes judgment, adaptability, and the will to act when hesitation could cost everything. For Raina Cole, that truth wasn't new. She had carried it with her through the Trasker range, through the narrow cut of Hades Gate, and back again. But now, she had passed it on. Each of those pilots, whether fresh-faced or seasoned, had faced moments in the exercise where instinct clashed with procedure, where the safer choice might have left a gap for the enemy to exploit. And each time, they found a way to close that gap. She knew they would carry that experience into the field. Some would fly combat sorties before the year was out. Others would return to their home units as the one pilot in the room who could speak with first-hand authority about what it means to fly below the envelope. To make the terrain your ally instead of your obstacle. Quietly, that influence would spread, flight by flight, mission by mission, until it became part of the fabric of how these crews thought about their role. Back on the flight line, Iron Fang sat cooling in the fading light. The maintenance crews moved around her like a pit team, checking every panel and seam after the day's evolutions. The aircraft had become as much a part of the program's identity as its lead instructor, both marked by experience, both built for endurance over glamour. Raina paused before climbing down from the cockpit after her final post-sortie check. From here, she could see the hangars lined up like sentinels, the wind tugging at the flags along the perimeter fence, and beyond that, the long stretch of open sky that had been her domain for so long. There was satisfaction in knowing the next generation was ready to take their place there, but there was also the unshakable understanding that readiness was temporary. Combat has a way of asking questions no training can fully anticipate. That was why she would keep flying, keep instructing, keep refining the edge. This program wasn't about creating carbon copies of her. It was about giving each pilot the tools to become the person who could make the hard call when the moment came, whether that meant diving into a canyon under fire or holding position against every instinct to move. She gathered her gear and walked the length of the tarmac toward the operations building. Inside, the day's data was already being archived, video footage tagged, and instructor notes filed for review. Somewhere down the hall, laughter rose from a group of pilots unwinding after the debrief, their energy lighter now that the pressure was off. That was good. They'd earned a night to breathe. Tomorrow the work would begin again. Different weather, different threats, new wrinkles in the plan to force adaptation. The repetition wasn't about chasing perfection. It was about making adaptability second nature. As she reached her quarters, Raina removed the Thunderstrike patch and set it on the table beside the neatly folded flight suit. Outside, the sun dipped low, staining the horizon in red and gold. She stood for a moment at the window, watching the light fade over the distant ridges. Somewhere out there, beyond the training grounds and the safety of controlled scenarios, another mission would someday demand the same resolve she had found in herself over those mountains. When that call came, for her or for one of the pilots she had trained, she wanted them to remember exactly what she had told them on the first day. The storm doesn't ask if you're ready. You just fly into it and make it yours. This is Veteran Biker. Thank you for staying with this story to the very end. If it's left you with something to think about, or if you've got your own perspective on what it takes to step into the fire, I'd like to hear it. Share it in the comments below. And if you want more stories of the people who face the impossible and come back with their own sky, make sure you're subscribed. There are more missions, more voices, and more lessons waiting just over the horizon. Stay with us, and we'll bring them to you.